Her German Shepherd wouldn't leave one wall alone. The radiator clicked in the Milwaukee probate office while her husband's will was read out loud. Every asset spoken, every name accounted for, except hers. At 68, Evelyn Harper sat beside her German Shepherd, Koda, listening as her life quietly shifted. All she was left with was a remote cabin in northern Minnesota, minimal market value. So she packed the car, drove north, and unlocked a door that was never meant to stay closed. If you were handed something that looked like rejection, would you open it or walk away? The probate office sat on the third floor of a narrow brick building just off Wisconsin Avenue. Outside, downtown Milwaukee moved like it always did. Buses hissing to a stop, horns tapping in short bursts, footsteps crossing wet pavement. Inside, it was too warm. The radiator in the corner clicked and rattled like it had something to say about the whole thing. Evelyn Harper sat upright in a leather chair that was slightly too low for her knees. 68 years old, retired librarian, widow of 12 days. Her hands rested in her lap, folded loosely. They looked smaller than she remembered, pale, veins rising faintly beneath the skin. She had trimmed her silver hair that morning, brushed it carefully, pinned it back the way Frank always said made her look capable. Beside her boots lay Koda. He was stretched out on the polished wood floor, front paws crossed neatly. A large German Shepherd, black saddle across his back, tan legs, thick winter coat still coming in. His ears were upright, not tense, just attentive. He had insisted on coming. Evelyn had not argued. Across the long oak table sat Brent Calloway, her stepson. He wore a navy suit that fit too snug across his shoulders. Clean shave, hair parted sharply to one side. He kept checking his phone and then slipping it face down again, as if the screen might accuse him of something. He did not look at her. Next to him sat his younger sister, Marissa. She dabbed at her eyes with a folded tissue. The crying had stopped. Now it was more about appearances. At the head of the table, attorney Roland Mercer adjusted his glasses and opened the folder in front of him. The sound of paper sliding against paper felt louder than it should have. "Thank you all for coming," he began. His voice was calm, professional, practiced. Evelyn stared at the grain of the table. She knew that pattern. Maple veneer. She'd once spent a summer cataloging furniture materials for a historical exhibit at the library. She focused on it now because it was easier than looking at Brent. The radiator clicked again. Mercer cleared his throat. "I will now read the last will and testament of Franklin David Harper." Franklin. He'd always introduced himself that way to strangers. Franklin. As if it carried weight. As if it explained something. Mercer began with the formal language. Date of execution. Witnesses. Amendments. The traffic outside blurred into a steady hum. Koda shifted slightly. Not much. Just enough to let her know he was still there. "To my son, Brent Calloway, I leave the residential property located at..." The address of the house Evelyn had lived in for 22 years. She did not move. The words continued. "Along with all furnishings and contents therein." Brent nodded once. Not toward her. Toward the table. "To my children, Brent Calloway and Marissa Calloway, I leave equal shares of my retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and remaining liquid assets." Marissa sniffed softly. Evelyn waited. She did not know what she was waiting for. A mention, a phrase, even a sentence. Something simple like, "To my wife, Evelyn." Mercer turned the page. The sound was clean. Final. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. Koda's head lifted. Just a little. Mercer continued. Specific personal items are distributed as follows. Frank's grandfather's watch. Brent. The framed lake painting from the hallway. Marissa. The antique fishing rods. Brent. Evelyn felt something tighten inside her chest. Not pain. Not yet. Just pressure. As if the air in the room had shifted. Her name had not been spoken. Not once. She looked at Brent. He still wasn't looking at her. Mercer paused. "There is one final property," he said, adjusting his glasses again. "A secondary structure located in northern Minnesota." Brent's brow furrowed slightly. Mercer read carefully. "To my wife, Evelyn Harper, I leave the cabin property at Alder Lake, Minnesota, along with any attached contents. The property is assessed as minimal market value." Minimal. The word hung there. Minimal. Evelyn blinked. A cabin. Frank had mentioned it once, years ago. Something about an old place up north. She had assumed it had been sold long ago. Minimal market value. Koda stood. Not abruptly. Not alarmed. He simply rose from the floor and pressed his shoulder lightly against her calf. She had not realized she was trembling until his weight steadied her. Mercer continued with closing statements, but the words felt distant now. Legal formalities. Signatures. Copies to be mailed. The radiator hissed. Brent finally looked up. "Well," he said quietly, "at least you'll have somewhere to go." Somewhere to go. Evelyn turned her head toward him. He smiled. Not unkindly. Not kindly either. Just neutral. As if this were a practical arrangement. As if the house she had dusted and cleaned and filled with books and birthday dinners had never been hers at all. Koda's ears tilted forward. He looked at Brent for a long moment, then back at her. Mercer closed the folder. That concludes the reading. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Marissa stood first. Brent followed. Evelyn remained seated for a second longer. Minimal market value. A cabin in northern Minnesota. Erased from the will. Koda nudged her hand gently with his nose. She reached down and rested her fingers in his fur. Warm. Solid. Real. Then she stood. The traffic outside continued moving, indifferent as ever. And for the first time since Frank's funeral, Evelyn felt something colder than grief. Not anger, not yet. Just the quiet understanding that her name had not been there, not where it should have been. The words stayed with her all the way down the courthouse steps. The late afternoon air had turned damp and metallic, the kind of cold that seeps through wool and settles in the joints. Downtown Milwaukee was busy in that restless way cities are when people are hurrying home. Heels clicking, engines revving, someone laughing too loudly across the street. It felt obscene somehow. Life continuing at full volume. Koda walked close to her knee, not pulling, not lagging. Just present. Her Subaru was parked 2 blocks away in a metered space she'd nearly forgotten to pay for. She unlocked it with hands that moved automatically, opened the back door, and waited. Koda jumped in without hesitation. He circled once on the back seat, then settled upright, facing forward. His ears stayed high, alert. She slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. The sound was final. For a moment, she didn't start the engine. She rested both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at the gray stone buildings across the street. Minimal market value. A cabin, somewhere north. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder. A message from Brent. "Let me know when you're picking up your things." Your things. She turned the key. The engine coughed once, then caught. By the time she pulled into the driveway of the house, the sky had begun to fade into that bruised purple just before sunset. The porch light was already on. Brent's car sat in the drive like it always did, too close to the garage door, slightly crooked. She parked at the curb. For 22 years, she had used the driveway. Tonight, she didn't. The front door opened before she reached the steps. Brent stood there, jacket zipped up, car keys in hand. He looked as though he'd been waiting. "I figured you'd come by," he said. His tone was neutral, polite almost. "I need a few things," she replied. He stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Marissa must have already begun organizing. The framed photographs on the hallway wall were gone. The small oak table near the stairs had been cleared of mail and knickknacks. It felt staged. Evelyn walked slowly toward the living room. Her bookshelf, her shelf, still stood against the far wall. The collection of hardcovers she'd carried through 3 decades of library work lined the wood in careful rows. She touched one, then another. "I'll just take what fits in the car," she said. Brent nodded. "That's probably best." Probably best. Koda moved quietly through the house, nose low, taking in changes. He paused at the kitchen doorway and looked toward the backyard as if expecting Frank to appear by the grill. When nothing happened, he returned to Evelyn's side. She packed 2 suitcases, clothing, a few sweaters, the thick navy coat she wore during Chicago winters before she met Frank, a pair of sensible boots. From the bedroom, she took her jewelry box. Not the expensive pieces, those had apparently already been itemized, but the small silver bracelet her mother had given her years ago. In the study, she filled a cardboard box with books. Not all of them, just the ones that had notes in the margins, the ones that felt like company. Koda's worn canvas bed lay near the back door. She rolled it up and tucked it under her arm. When she returned to the entryway, Brent was standing near the staircase. "You really think you're going to stay up there?" he asked. She met his eyes for the first time since the office. "I'm going to see it," she said. "It's not insulated well. Dad mentioned that once. And it's pretty isolated." Isolated. She almost smiled. "That won't be a problem." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "If it doesn't work out, we can talk." We. She adjusted the strap on her bag. "Take care of the house, she said quietly. Then she stepped past him. The suburban neighborhood smelled faintly of wet leaves and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere, a lawn sprinkler clicked on even though it was nearly November. She loaded the suitcases into the back of the Subaru, set the box of books carefully behind the passenger seat, tucked Koda's bed along the side. Koda jumped in and sat upright, watching the house. She did not look back at Brent again. Interstate 35 stretched north in long, steady lanes of asphalt. The city lights thinned behind her, dissolving into clusters, then into darkness. Traffic grew lighter. The hum of tires against pavement settled into a rhythm. Koda remained upright in the back seat for the first hour. He didn't whine, didn't pace, just watched. Occasionally his amber eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. Each time she nodded slightly, as if assuring him she was still there, as if assuring herself. The sky deepened to black. Pine silhouettes began to line the highway. The air through the vents smelled cleaner, colder. She had not told anyone she was leaving that night. No friends, no neighbors. There hadn't seemed much to say. Her thoughts drifted back to the office, to the sound of pages turning, to the way her name had simply not appeared. She tried to remember the last conversation she and Frank had about the future. It had been ordinary. Groceries, the leaking upstairs sink, whether to repaint the hallway. Nothing about revisions, nothing about separate cabins, nothing about being written out. Her grip tightened slightly on the wheel. Koda lowered himself slowly onto the seat, but kept his head lifted, watching the windshield from behind her shoulder. His ears moved now and then, responding to passing trucks or sudden wind gusts. The further north they drove, the less certain she felt. Not about money, about something quieter, about the years. Had she misunderstood the shape of her own marriage? Had there been a version of Frank she never saw? Or had she chosen not to look too closely? The highway sign for Duluth appeared overhead, green against the dark sky. She passed it, kept going. The cabin sat beyond that. 20 miles from the nearest grocery store, the lawyer had said. Minimal market value. She exhaled slowly. The road narrowed after midnight. 2 lanes, then 1. Fewer streetlights, more forest. When she finally pulled into a small roadside motel near the Minnesota border, the clock on the dashboard read 12:47 a.m. She turned off the engine. Silence. Real silence. Koda stood immediately, stretching long front paws forward, back arched. He hopped down when she opened the door and shook once, as if shedding the entire day from his coat. Cold air rushed in. She locked the car and looked up at the dark sky. Somewhere beyond the trees and miles of empty road sat a cabin she had never seen. A cabin that had replaced her name. She slipped her hand into Koda's thick fur. "All right," she murmured. Koda looked up at her, steady and unblinking. Then he turned toward the motel door as if to say, "We're not done yet." Neither of them were. Morning came pale and thin through the motel curtains. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee drifting in from the front office. Evelyn had slept in stretches, waking every few hours to the sound of trucks passing on the highway. Koda had not moved much. He lay on the floor near the door, one ear angled toward the hallway, as if guarding something that no longer existed. By 8:30, they were back on the road. The farther north they drove, the more the landscape changed. The interstate gave way to a smaller highway. Then that narrowed into a 2-lane road edged with birch trees and long strips of marsh grass. Pine branches leaned low over the asphalt. Patches of frost still clung to shaded ground. A wooden sign appeared just past a bend in the road. Alder Lake. 18 miles. Evelyn slowed slightly. The air felt different here. Cleaner. Sharper. When she cracked her window, it carried the faint scent of damp leaves and something mineral, stone and water. They passed a gas station with 2 pumps, a bait shop with a faded mural of walleye along its side, a small church with a white steeple and a gravel lot. Then the road curved again, and the lake appeared. It was wider than she expected, a sheet of dull silver stretching beneath a gray sky. The shoreline was uneven, broken by clusters of cedar and stretches of tall grass already turning brown. A smaller road branched off toward the water. She turned onto it. The tires crunched over gravel. The car rocked gently as it rolled through shallow ruts. Koda stood up in the back seat now, bracing himself with his front paws against the seat back, peering over her shoulder. The mailbox came first. A narrow post leaning slightly to the left. The numbers were still there, faded but readable. She pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. Silence. No traffic hum. No distant sirens. Just wind moving through branches and the faint ripple of water against something wooden. The cabin stood about 30 yards from the lake. It was smaller than she imagined, but sturdier than she feared. The siding was weathered gray. Not rotted, just aged. The roof sagged slightly near the back corner. The porch steps dipped toward the center. One shutter hung unevenly beside the front window. Minimal market value. She stepped out of the car. Cold air brushed across her face. Not harsh, just steady. Koda jumped down beside her and paused, scanning the clearing. His body stiffened for a moment, assessing. Then he began to move. Slowly at first. He walked the perimeter of the cabin in a wide arc, nose low to the ground. He sniffed the porch posts, the edge of the steps, the corner where siding met stone foundation. Not frantic, methodical. Evelyn stood near the car and watched him. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just absorbed. When she approached the porch, the boards creaked under her weight. The railing felt solid when she pressed her palm against it. The key from the lawyer's envelope felt heavier now in her coat pocket. She pulled it out and held it for a moment. Simple brass. No engraving. She slid it into the lock. It turned without resistance. That surprised her more than anything else. The door opened inward with a long, dry groan. The air inside smelled like cedar, dust, and cold stone. Not mold, not decay, just stillness. Light filtered through the front windows in narrow beams. The living room was modest. A worn leather couch sat against one wall. A narrow wooden table beneath the window. A cast-iron stove anchored near the center of the room, its surface dark and slightly rusted. A braided rug lay crooked on the floor. The place had not been lived in recently, but it had not been abandoned to ruin either. She stepped inside. The floorboards creaked in a different tone than the porch, deeper, echoing slightly. Koda entered last, tail low but not tucked. He paused just past the threshold and inhaled deeply. Once, twice. Then he moved through the space. He went first to the kitchen area, if it could be called that. A narrow counter, a small refrigerator, cabinets with metal handles dulled by age. He sniffed the base of the stove. Then he moved toward the hallway leading to what she assumed was the bedroom. She followed slowly. The bedroom held a single iron frame bed and a small dresser. The mattress looked old but not sagging. A folded quilt lay at the foot of the bed, blue and white squares stitched together carefully. She reached out and touched the fabric. It was clean. The bathroom was small, shower stall, sink with porcelain chipped along the rim. She returned to the living room. Koda was standing near the front window now, staring out toward the lake. The dock leaned slightly into the water, its planks faded and one corner dipping lower than the rest. The lake lapped gently against its edge. No boats, no voices, just open space. She moved to the cast-iron stove and crouched beside it. A small stack of split firewood was arranged neatly in a crate nearby. Neatly. She brushed her fingers over the top piece. Dry. Who had stacked it? She stood and walked toward the back of the cabin. A second door led outside to a smaller clearing. Behind the main structure stood a shed, taller than she expected. Its double doors closed tight. The clearing extended toward a cluster of tall pines. Koda joined her at the back door and waited as she opened it. The air outside felt colder here, shaded by trees. He stepped out first and began another slow circuit. His nose traced the edge of the foundation. He paused near one corner, sniffed longer, then moved on. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe and watched. It struck her then, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet shift, that this place did not feel like something discarded. It felt paused, as if someone had left and intended to return. Wind pushed through the pines, making them whisper against one another. Koda completed his circle and came back to her side. He sat down, pressing lightly against her leg. She rested her hand on his head. "Well," she said softly. The word disappeared into the open air. She turned back inside and began opening cabinets. Most were empty. A few held basic items, an old tin of tea, a box of matches, 2 enamel mugs. She opened a drawer in the table. Inside lay a single folded piece of paper. Her breath caught. She lifted it carefully. It was blank, just yellowed slightly at the edges. She exhaled slowly and slid it back into place. The afternoon light shifted as clouds moved overhead. She carried the box of books inside and set it near the couch. Unrolled Koda's bed near the stove. He circled it once and lay down without hesitation, chin resting on his paws, eyes still moving. She stood in the center of the room. The silence here was different than the house in Milwaukee. There was no hum of appliances, no distant lawnmowers, no neighbor's television bleeding through the wall. Just wind, water, wood, minimal market value. She looked at the lake again. "This is what you left me," she murmured. Koda lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice. She moved toward the window and rested her palm against the glass. Cold. She did not feel anger yet. Not fully. Just distance. As if the last 22 years had been folded and placed somewhere out of reach. Behind her, Koda stood up again. He began to move slowly across the living room floor, nose grazing the wood in long, deliberate passes. Not aimless. Not restless. Searching. She watched him. He paused near the fireplace wall, then moved on for now. Outside, the lake shifted under the wind, and the cabin, silent and steady, held whatever it had been holding long before she arrived. The first night was restless. The wind moved through the trees in long, low breaths. Every so often, the cabin answered back with a creak from the rafters or a soft tap from the siding. The cast-iron stove took patience. She fed it 2 small logs and watched the flame catch, orange and hesitant at first, then steadier. Koda refused to settle immediately. He walked the perimeter of the living room twice, nose close to the floorboards. He paused at the door, listening. He moved toward the back hallway. He stopped near the fireplace wall again, just for a second, then returned to his bed. When he finally lay down, he kept one ear lifted. Sometime after midnight, the lake made a sound that pulled her awake, a deep crack. Sharp, echoing across the water like a distant rifle shot. Her heart jumped before she remembered where she was. Ice. It had to be ice shifting against itself. Koda was already standing at the window, body rigid but not alarmed. He looked back at her, then out again, as if confirming the source. "It's just the lake," she whispered. He didn't relax immediately. He waited, listening. So did she. Morning came pale and silver. A low mist hovered just above the water. The dock leaned quietly into the shallows, the boards damp from condensation. The trees behind the cabin seemed taller in daylight, their branches etched against a wide gray sky. Evelyn pulled on her navy coat and stepped outside with Koda. The air carried that faint mineral scent again. Cold water, wet bark. She needed supplies. The refrigerator inside the cabin hummed when she plugged it in, but it was empty. The cabinets held little more than 2 mugs and a tin of loose tea. She drove toward town just after 9. Alder Ridge announced itself with a small wooden sign and a single blinking yellow light at the intersection of Main and Lake Street. It was the kind of town that didn't rush. A hardware store with peeling red paint stood near the corner. Across from it, a bakery with wide front windows and lace curtains. A bait shop. A post office no bigger than a shed. She parked near the bakery. The bell above the door jingled when she entered. Warmth wrapped around her immediately. Cinnamon. Fresh bread. Coffee. Behind the counter stood a woman in her early 60s with dark hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a flour-dusted apron over a green sweater. "Morning," the woman said, wiping her hands on a towel. "You're new." Her tone wasn't suspicious, just observant. "Yes," Evelyn replied. "I'm staying at the cabin near the North Bend." The woman's hands stilled for half a second. "Harper Place?" she asked. Evelyn nodded slowly. "My husband owned it." The woman's eyes sharpened, but her voice stayed warm. "Marlene Ortiz." She extended her hand. "Evelyn Harper." They shook. "And this must be Koda," Marlene said, glancing down as the dog entered behind her. Koda paused just inside the door, scanning the room before stepping fully inside. "He's well-mannered," Marlene added. "He tries." Marlene leaned against the counter. "Didn't think anyone was using that cabin anymore." Evelyn hesitated. "My husband left it to me." "Left it." Marlene's gaze flickered, quick and subtle. "Frank was up here more than folks realized," she said, almost casually. The words landed softly. "Was he?" Evelyn asked. Marlene turned to pour coffee into a paper cup. "He'd come through every few months, pick up supplies, talk about the lake." Evelyn's fingers tightened around her purse strap. "He never mentioned it much," she said. Marlene handed her the coffee. Some people keep their quiet places quiet. There was something in her tone. Measured. Not gossip. Not accusation. Just fact. Koda shifted his weight, watching Marlene carefully. Not distrustful, just reading. "You'll want groceries from Lindstrom's Market," Marlene continued. 2 blocks down. Gus still runs it." Evelyn thanked her and stepped back outside. The cold hit differently after the warmth of the bakery. She walked down the sidewalk toward the market. The boards beneath her boots creaked faintly. Lindstrom's was narrower than it looked from the outside. A bell chimed when she entered. A tall man in his 70s stood near the register, his white hair combed straight back, shoulders slightly rounded but sturdy. He wore a flannel shirt beneath a canvas vest. He looked up. "Morning," he said. She introduced herself again. His expression changed when she mentioned the cabin. "Frank's place," he said. "Yes." Gus Lindstrom rested his hands on the counter. "Haven't seen him in a while." "He passed," she said quietly. A pause. "Sorry to hear that." He studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Not rude, just weighing something. "He always had an eye on the shoreline," Gus added. "Made sure things stayed the way they were." "What do you mean?" she asked. Gus shrugged lightly. "Just that. Didn't like developers sniffing around." Developers. The word felt foreign here, among shelves of canned beans and fishing line. "He talked about the lake?" she asked. "Talked about a lot of things," Gus said. "Didn't talk about everything." Another sentence that stopped just short of explanation. She left the store with 2 grocery bags and a tighter knot in her chest. Back at the cabin, the air felt heavier. Koda moved through the doorway first and immediately began his quiet patrol again. He checked the kitchen, the hallway. Then he returned to the fireplace wall. He stood there longer this time, ears forward, body still. Evelyn set the groceries on the table and watched him. "What is it?" she asked softly. He didn't scratch, didn't whine. He just stared. Then he turned away, moving toward the back door as if nothing had happened. She felt a ripple of unease. Frank had been here. Often. More than she knew. He'd driven hours north and never said why. She walked toward the fireplace and pressed her palm lightly against the wood paneling beside it. Solid. Unremarkable. She stepped back. Outside, the wind picked up again. By late afternoon, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled in from the west, low and heavy. The first sharp crack from the lake came just after sunset. Louder this time. Closer. It echoed across the clearing and into the cabin walls. Evelyn froze mid-step. Another crack followed, splintering across the surface of the water. Koda was at the window in seconds, muscles tight but not panicked. She joined him. The lake surface shifted under fading light, thin fractures spreading outward like veins. The sound wasn't violent, just powerful, unavoidable. She stood there a long time, staring at the shifting ice. "Up here more than folks realized," she murmured to herself. Koda remained at her side. The town knew something. Not a secret exactly, but a piece she had never been handed. When she finally turned away from the window, the cabin felt different. Not empty, not neglected, but layered. As if it had been living a parallel life while she stayed in Milwaukee, believing she understood the shape of her own. Outside, the lake cracked again. And inside, the silence deepened into something that felt less like possibility and more like a question waiting to be asked. The wind died sometime after midnight. The cabin settled. Evelyn lay awake in the iron bed, staring at the ceiling where faint shadows moved with the last glow of embers in the stove. She could hear Koda breathing from the living room. Steady. Even. Just before dawn, he rose. She knew because the boards shifted under his weight. Not hurried, not restless. Intent. She sat up slowly, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, and stepped into the hall. Koda stood near the fireplace wall, not at the window this time, not listening for the lake. He was facing the wood paneling beside the stone hearth. He didn't bark, didn't scratch wildly like a dog chasing a scent trail. He sat, ears forward, body upright, nose lifting slightly as he drew in air, waiting. "Koda," she said softly. He didn't turn his head. He only shifted one ear back to acknowledge her voice, then faced forward again. She walked toward him. The fireplace was built of stacked fieldstone, uneven and solid. The wall beside it was paneled in dark wood, the boards running vertical from floor to ceiling. Nothing about it looked unusual. She pressed her hand flat against the wood. Cold. The grain rough beneath her palm. Koda stood up slowly and took one step closer to the wall. His nose hovered inches from the surface. He inhaled again, deeper this time. German Shepherd focus was unmistakable. Not excitement, not anxiety. Recognition. "What is it?" she murmured. He lifted his paw and touched the wall once. Not a scratch. A tap. Light. Deliberate. Then he lowered it and sat again. Her pulse quickened. It could be nothing. Old cabins made noises. Wood shifted. Animals nested in walls. She pressed harder along the boards, moving her palm slowly from left to right. The surface felt solid at first, tight against the studs behind it. She stepped back. The morning light was brighter now, slipping through the front window and falling across the floor. Koda didn't move. She reached for the poker leaning beside the stove and used the blunt end to tap gently along the paneling. Solid. 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 Then, a hollow knock, subtle, almost lost beneath the echo of the room. She froze, tapped again in the same spot. The sound returned, different from the rest. Her throat tightened. "Koda," she whispered. He stood. This time he didn't paw at the wood. He leaned forward and pressed his nose to the seam between two boards, inhaling slowly as if reading something invisible. The wind outside rose briefly and shook the eaves. The cabin creaked in response. For a second, doubt crept in. Maybe it was just age, a loose board, but the hollow sound had been real. She knelt down and examined the base of the wall more closely. The boards near the floor were slightly darker, as if they had been handled more often. One nail head sat just a fraction lower than the others. She reached for it. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She pressed inward gently. Nothing. She pressed harder. The nail gave slightly beneath her thumb. Not loose. Intentional. Her breath caught. Koda stepped back 2 paces, clearing space. Watching. She stood and ran her hand higher along the paneling. Halfway up the wall, near shoulder height, her palm met a slight unevenness. She pushed. Nothing. She shifted her weight and pushed again, firmer. A faint click. She froze. The click had come from inside the wall. She glanced at Koda. He was still. Completely still. Waiting. Her hands trembled now, not from cold, but from something sharper. Anticipation edged with fear. She slid her fingers along the vertical seam and pressed at the point where the hollow sound had echoed. The board shifted inward by less than half an inch. She stepped back. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. She pressed again. The panel moved more freely this time, swinging inward on a concealed hinge no wider than her hand. Behind it was darkness. She reached for the lamp on the side table and carried it closer, angling the light toward the opening. Dust floated in the narrow beam. Inside the cavity, resting on a small wooden shelf, was a metal tube, about a foot long, brushed steel, sealed at both ends with rubber rings. Not rusted, not forgotten. Placed. Her chest tightened so sharply She had to sit back on her heels. Koda approached slowly and sniffed toward the opening. He did not attempt to grab it, did not paw at it again. He had done his part. She reached into the hollow space and wrapped her fingers around the tube. It was heavier than she expected. Cool. Steady. When she pulled it free, the wood behind it revealed clean edges. No splintering, no rough cuts. This had been built into the cabin, on purpose. She sat on the braided rug and held the tube in her lap. The stove popped softly as the fire inside settled. For a moment, she did not open it. She studied it instead. Minimal market value. The words echoed in her mind. Koda lay down beside her, his body angled slightly toward the front door as if guarding the room. She twisted one end of the tube. It resisted at first, then gave with a low metallic turn. A soft seal released. She paused. Her heart beat loud in her ears. Whatever was inside had been meant to stay hidden, meant to stay safe. The wind moved across the lake again, brushing against the cabin walls in a long, low sweep. She drew in a breath and removed the cap. Inside, rolled tightly, was paper, and beneath it, something thicker. Leather. Her fingers hovered above it. The silence inside the cabin shifted from question to revelation. Koda lifted his head slightly, and Evelyn reached inside. Her fingers brushed against paper first. Not brittle, not ancient. Carefully rolled. She eased it out and laid it gently on the rug. Beneath it, something firmer slid forward. A leather-bound notebook, dark brown, worn smooth along the edges from use. Her breath came shallow. Koda shifted closer, lowering his head near her shoulder, but not touching the items. He watched her hands. She unrolled the paper first. Photographs. 3 of them, stacked together. The top one showed Frank. Younger. Much younger than the man she had married. His hair darker, his shoulders broader, standing near this very lake with sunlight striking the water behind him. He was smiling. Not the polite smile he used at neighborhood gatherings, but a full one. Open. Unburdened. Beside him stood 2 other men. One of them she recognized immediately. Gus Lindstrom, though his beard had been darker then. The other she didn't know. They were holding a wooden boat frame between them. She turned to the second photograph. The cabin, years ago. The siding fresher. The dock straight. No sagging porch. The third photograph made her chest tighten. Frank standing alone on the shoreline at sunset. His expression serious this time, looking toward the horizon. She swallowed. He had stood here, more than once, without telling her. She set the photographs aside and picked up the notebook. The leather felt soft, flexible, like something opened often. She hesitated before flipping the cover. Inside, the first page was dated 14 years earlier. The handwriting was Frank's. She knew the slant of it. The way his letters leaned slightly forward, as if always in motion. The entry was simple. Initial meeting with cooperative members completed. Funding structure agreed. Her pulse quickened. She turned the page. The entries continued. Month after month. Years. Payments recorded carefully. Not large sums at first. Then gradually larger contributions. Each entry precise. Dock Reinforcement Fund. Winter Storm Repair. Youth Apprenticeship Stipend. Approved. She blinked. Youth Apprenticeship. Another page. Alder Lake Cooperative Trust. Expansion proposal. The name was written in bold strokes. Alder Lake Cooperative Trust. She flipped faster now. There were meeting notes, signatures, mentions of shoreline preservation clauses and voting rights percentages. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't a casual investment. This was involvement, long-term, deliberate. At the back of the notebook, folded neatly, was a single sheet of thicker paper. She unfolded it slowly. Not legal language, just a sentence. If anything happens to me, she deserves the truth. The word she caught her breath on wasn't happens. It was she. He hadn't written her name, but he hadn't needed to. Her vision blurred slightly. She blinked it away. Outside, the lake made a low groan as ice shifted beneath warming daylight. Koda's tail brushed lightly against the rug once. She closed the notebook and sat back against the couch. The cabin felt smaller now, or maybe she felt larger inside it. Frank had not been coming here to fish. He had not been escaping. He had been building something. She stood slowly and walked to the front window, notebook pressed against her chest. The lake lay calm under pale winter light. Gus had said Frank always had an eye on the shoreline. Marlene had said he talked about the lake. She had never once heard him mention a cooperative trust. Not once. A flicker of something sharper than confusion moved through her. Not betrayal exactly. Something more complicated. Why had he kept this from her? Why build something so significant in silence? Her mind began connecting pieces she hadn't known were scattered. Brent pushing for estate revisions during Frank's hospitalization. The quick signing. The careful wording. The minimal market value note. She walked back to the fireplace wall and looked at the open panel. He had hidden this. Not discarded. Not forgotten. Hidden and sealed. For her to find. The thought made her skin prickle. Koda rose and moved toward the door, glancing back at her once. He seemed calmer now, purpose fulfilled. She stepped outside into the cold air. The dock leaned quietly against the water. The shed behind the cabin stood still among the pines. Somewhere beyond those trees was Alder Ridge, the town that had exchanged glances when she mentioned her name. The town that knew something she did not. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath cloud in front of her. The trust, cooperative, voting rights, shoreline control. This was not a hobby. This was leverage. She looked back at the cabin, the panel still open, the notebook waiting on the rug, the photographs scattered carefully beside it. A different kind of silence settled over her now. Not the emptiness from the will reading. Not the uncertainty of arrival. Something sharper. Directed. She stepped back inside and closed the hidden panel carefully, sliding it into place until it clicked softly. Then she sat at the table and opened the notebook again, this time more slowly, reading each entry, learning the names listed in the margins. Gus Lindstrom, Harold Myers, Alder Ridge Marina Board. She traced the numbers in the margins with her finger. Shares, percentages. Frank's name appeared often, but not always at the top. Sometimes it was second, sometimes third. Shared ownership, shared responsibility. The final entries were dated just 8 months before his death. Majority position secured. Protections finalized. Review with Celia. Completed. Celia. A new name. She closed the notebook gently. The emotional weight shifted again. The man she thought she knew had lived a parallel life up here. Not reckless. not secret in a cruel way, intentional. She pressed her palms flat against the wooden table. Whatever the Alder Lake Cooperative Trust was, it was not minimal. And whatever Frank had done, it had not been careless. The lake cracked again outside, louder this time, as if responding to the shift inside her. Koda lifted his head, but did not move. Evelyn looked toward the door. Tomorrow, she would drive into town again. This time not for groceries, this time for answers. The next morning arrived clear and brittle. Sunlight spread across Alder Lake in pale sheets, making the thin ice shimmer like cracked glass. The sky was an unbroken blue, cold and wide. Evelyn dressed carefully. Dark slacks, her navy coat, the leather notebook tucked securely inside her bag, the photographs placed between its pages. Koda followed her to the car without needing a command. He jumped into the back seat and sat upright, alert but calm. His eyes stayed on her as she started the engine. The road into Alder Ridge looked different in daylight, less uncertain, more deliberate. She parked in front of the bakery again, but this time she didn't go inside. Instead, she crossed the street toward a narrow building with frosted windows and a small brass plaque beside the door. Hahn and Pierce, attorneys at law. The bell above the door gave a short, metallic chime when she entered. The office smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil. A tall bookshelf lined one wall. Framed photographs of shoreline and lake scenes hung neatly in rows. A woman in her early 40s stepped out from behind a desk. She was composed, sharp-eyed, dark hair pulled into a low bun, navy blazer, crisp white blouse. "Yes?" she said gently. "I'm looking for Celia Hahn," Evelyn replied. "I'm Celia." Evelyn reached into her bag and removed the notebook, placing it carefully on the desk. "My husband was Franklin Harper." Something flickered across Celia's face. Recognition. "Of course," she said quietly. "Please, sit." The office felt warmer than the air outside. Too warm. Celia opened the notebook without hesitation. She flipped through the pages, scanning the entries. "He told you," Evelyn said. Celia looked up. "No," she replied. "He didn't." The words settled heavily. "He wanted you protected," Celia continued. "But he wasn't ready to explain everything. He believed he had time." Time. Evelyn folded her hands tightly in her lap. "The will erased me," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "He left me a cabin of minimal market value." Celia closed the notebook. "That language applied to the estate," she said carefully, "not the trust." Evelyn blinked. "The Alder Lake Cooperative Trust," Celia continued, her tone precise, "is a separate legal entity. It owns majority control over shoreline development rights and marina operations along this section of the lake." Evelyn felt the air thin. "Frank secured controlling interest 15 years ago," Celia said. "He did it gradually, quietly. He funded repairs, youth programs, dock stabilization. He bought out smaller shareholders who wanted to sell." The images in the notebook aligned suddenly with meaning. "Why?" Evelyn asked. "Because developers were circling," Celia replied. "Large firms, resort investors. They wanted this lake, he didn't." Evelyn's throat tightened. "He never told me." Celia nodded once. "He believed it was safer that way." "Safer for who?" "For you." Silence. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Celia leaned forward slightly. When Brent requested amendments to the estate during your husband's hospitalization, we were already aware of it. Evelyn's head lifted sharply. He asked for changes, Celia said evenly. We reviewed the documents. The cabin property was excluded from the estate structure years earlier. It anchors the trust. Anchors? It holds majority voting power. Without that cabin parcel, the cooperative loses controlling interest. Whoever holds it directs development decisions. The room seemed to tilt. Minimal market value, Evelyn repeated quietly. Celia's mouth curved faintly. The cabin itself isn't worth much. The land beneath it is. Evelyn stared at the framed shoreline photographs on the wall. Frank had built this, piece by piece, without telling her. He shielded it, Celia said, long before his illness, long before Brent knew what it meant. The emotional weight shifted again. Not confusion, not suspicion, something steadier. Frank hadn't erased her. He had moved something out of reach. For me, she said softly. Celia met her eyes. Yes. Evelyn swallowed. And Brent? Celia's expression hardened slightly. If he attempts to challenge the trust, the review process will examine all revisions made during your husband's medical treatment. The words hung there. Review process. Examine. Evelyn understood enough. Brent had pushed, but not carefully enough. You have full legal authority over the cabin property and trust voting rights, Celia concluded. It is yours. The phrase settled deep. Yours. For the first time since the probate office, the cold inside her chest loosened slightly. She stepped back outside into the bright winter air. The lake beyond town shimmered beneath sunlight. Koda was already standing at the passenger door, watching her. She opened it, and he jumped in smoothly. When she started the car, her hands no longer trembled. The drive back to the cabin felt shorter, clearer. The shoreline trees seemed sharper against the sky. When she pulled into the driveway, she didn't pause. She stepped out, closed the door firmly, and stood facing the lake. The dock leaned. The shed stood silent. The wind moved softly across the clearing. This isn't minimal, she murmured. Koda stood beside her, tail low but steady. Inside the cabin, she placed the notebook on the table again. This time not as a discovery, as a foundation. Frank had built something here, protected it. Not for Brent, not for Marissa, for her. The realization did not erase the hurt of the will reading, but it changed its shape. Outside, a vehicle passed slowly on the gravel road beyond the trees. Evelyn turned toward the sound instinctively. The engine noise faded. The clearing returned to stillness. But something had shifted. The truth about the cabin was no longer a question. It was leverage, and someone would eventually come looking for it. It didn't take long. 3 days later, just after noon, Koda's head lifted before the engine sound reached her ears. He had been lying near the window, watching snow melt drip from the eaves. The sun had warmed the clearing just enough to loosen patches of ice along the shoreline. Water moved in slow ripples where the lake had begun to open. Koda stood, not alert in fear, alert in recognition. Evelyn heard it then, the low hum of a vehicle approaching along the gravel road, not the steady rattle of a local pickup. This engine was smoother, heavier. She stepped outside onto the porch. The black SUV rounded the bend slowly, tires crunching across thawing gravel. Brent stepped out first. He wore the same navy coat from the probate office, though it looked less sharp against the muted backdrop of pine and water. Behind him, a man she didn't recognize emerged from the passenger side. Mid-50s, polished boots, tailored jacket. He carried a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. Koda moved to stand beside Evelyn. His tail lowered. His ears rose, calm, steady. Brent looked around the clearing as if measuring it. "Well," he said lightly, "you've settled in." Evelyn didn't answer. The wind shifted between them. Brent walked closer to the porch, careful with his steps. The other man followed at a polite distance. "This is Mr. Halverson," Brent said. "He represents North Point Development." The man gave a small nod. "Mrs. Harper?" His voice was smooth. Evelyn remained on the porch. "What do you want?" she asked. Brent's jaw tightened slightly. "We need to talk about the property," he said. "Specifically, your interest in the Alder Lake Cooperative Trust." The words were rehearsed. She folded her arms. "I met with Celia Hahn." Brent's expression shifted. "She told me what the cabin anchors." The man with the portfolio adjusted his grip but said nothing. Brent stepped closer to the bottom step. "You have majority voting control," he said. "That wasn't made clear during the will reading." "No," she replied evenly. "It wasn't." A pause. North Point Development. The phrase rolled through her mind. Brent continued. "We've been in discussions for months, long before Dad passed. There's a resort proposal, shoreline improvements, tourism, jobs, and profits," she said quietly. Brent didn't flinch. "Yes." He stepped up one stair. "We're offering you a partnership, shared control. You retain a portion. We handle development." Koda shifted his stance. He moved one step forward, positioning himself between Evelyn and Brent. Not aggressive, not growling, simply present. Brent glanced down at the dog. "He's well trained," he muttered. "Yes," she said softly. "He is." Halverson finally spoke. "The lake is underutilized," he said calmly. "There's demand for waterfront property. You're holding a key parcel. Without your vote, the cooperative blocks progress." Progress. The word sounded too clean in this clearing. Evelyn stepped down one stair, meeting Brent at eye level. "You knew," she said quietly. "About the trust." Brent exhaled. "Dad mentioned it," he admitted. "Not details, just that he had investments. He revised the will during his hospital stay." Brent's face hardened slightly. That was his decision. "And if it wasn't?" she asked. Silence. The wind brushed through the pines again. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded document. "Celia explained the review process," she said. "Any legal challenge to the trust triggers a full audit of estate amendments made during hospitalization." Halverson's posture shifted. Brent's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't," he began. "I would," she said evenly. The calm in her voice surprised even her. Koda remained still, eyes fixed forward. Brent glanced toward the lake, then back at her. "You're going to block this," he said. "I'm going to protect it." His lips pressed thin. "You think Dad built this for you?" The question carried more edge than he intended. She didn't hesitate. "Yes." Something flickered behind his eyes. Doubt, annoyance, fear. Halverson stepped back slightly. "Perhaps we should revisit this later," he said carefully. Brent ignored him. "You don't even live here," he said. "You don't understand what this could become." Evelyn looked past him toward the water. "I understand exactly what it already is." The silence stretched. Koda's tail moved once against the porch boards. Not a wag. A steady sweep. Brent finally stepped down from the stair. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she replied. "It isn't." The SUV door shut harder than necessary. Gravel snapped under the tires as they reversed. Evelyn stood on the porch until the vehicle disappeared behind the trees. The clearing felt larger afterward, quieter. Koda relaxed slightly, his ears lowering as the engine noise faded. She crouched and placed her hand against his shoulder. "Good boy," she murmured. He leaned into her touch. The lake shimmered under the pale winter sun. For the first time since arriving, she felt something settle into place. Not confusion, not hesitation. Resolve. Inside the cabin, the notebook remained open on the table. The entries about shoreline preservation and youth programs lay in neat rows. Frank had not built this for profit. He had built it to hold something steady, and she would not let it unravel. Outside, the ice cracked again, but softer this time. Not a fracture. A release. The lake did not break all at once. It gave way slowly, in patient seams that widened under the pull of sunlight. Patches of open water appeared along the shoreline first, dark and reflective. By late February, the ice near the dock thinned enough to show movement beneath it. Evelyn began attending the cooperative meetings 2 weeks after Brent's visit. They were held in the back room of Lindstrom's market, between the shelves of canned goods and the old refrigerator that hummed louder than necessary. Folding chairs circled a scarred wooden table. Coffee brewed in a metal pot that had probably been there since the 70s. The first meeting was quiet. Gus Lindstrom sat near the head of the table, hands folded, eyes steady. Marlene Ortiz brought a tin of sugar cookies and placed them near the center. A handful of others introduced themselves. Harold from the marina, Nora who managed the summer rentals, a young man named Caleb who had grown up on the South Shore. They didn't treat her like an outsider, but they watched her carefully. "Frank was committed," Gus said simply. "We need to know if you are." She looked around the room. "I am," she replied. No speech, no grand promises, just that. From then on, she attended every meeting. She read through shoreline agreements and preservation clauses at the kitchen table late into the night. Koda lay nearby, lifting his head whenever she turned a page too sharply. She learned how voting percentages worked, how marina shares were structured, how the trust protected dock access for residents instead of selling it to private investors. The work steadied her. Spring edged closer, but winter still lingered in the air. Snow melted during the day and refroze at night, turning the ground into a mosaic of slush and brittle ice. One evening, Marlene approached her outside the bakery. "We're thinking of bringing back the winter gathering," she said, brushing flour from her coat sleeve. "We used to do it every year before the trust started having funding problems." "What did it involve?" Evelyn asked. "Lanterns on the shoreline, music, soup, kids skating when the ice was strong enough." She hesitated. Frank funded it quietly the last few years. The information landed softly. Evelyn nodded. "Then we'll bring it back," she said. The weeks that followed were full in a way she hadn't expected. She spent mornings reviewing cooperative documents, afternoons walking the shoreline with Gus to inspect dock supports and measure areas where erosion had begun to creep inward. Koda accompanied them everywhere. Children from town had started greeting him by name. One afternoon, a small boy tied a strip of blue ribbon around Koda's collar and declared him Dock Patrol. Koda tolerated it with patient dignity. At the marina workshop, a small group of teenagers gathered under Harold's supervision to repair an old wooden rowboat. The smell of cedar shavings and motor oil hung in the air. "You sure about this?" Harold asked her quietly one afternoon as she watched from the doorway. "Yes," she said. The funding for the youth apprenticeship program had been outlined clearly in Frank's notebook. It was one of the entries she'd traced with her finger that first night. It would not be erased. The winter gathering arrived on a clear Saturday evening in late February. The lake ice had thickened again after a cold snap. Lanterns lined the shoreline, small glass jars with candles flickering inside them. The light reflected softly across the frozen surface. A fire pit crackled near the dock. The air smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon. Marlene ladled soup into paper bowls. Gus stood near the marina, shaking hands with neighbors. Someone brought a guitar. Evelyn stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. She had not planned to speak, but Gus nudged her gently. "Say something," he murmured. She stepped forward. The lantern light cast a warm glow across the gathered faces. Some she recognized now by name. Others she was still learning. "Thank you for coming," she began. Her voice carried further than she expected. "This lake means something. To all of us." She paused. "And it's worth protecting." "No more than that." The crowd murmured softly in agreement. Koda moved through the gathering easily, weaving between boots and children's legs. Someone had tied a second ribbon around his collar, this one red. A little girl crouched and wrapped her arms around his neck. He stood still, tail sweeping gently across the snow. The guitar began to play, a simple melody. For a moment, the sound of laughter replaced the crack of ice. Evelyn stepped back and watched the lanterns flicker. The cold air stung her cheeks. The lake stretched wide and open, holding the reflections of light. She felt something unfamiliar rise within her. Not relief, not triumph. Belonging. Not granted. Earned. Marlene joined her at the edge of the clearing. "He'd be proud," she said quietly. Evelyn looked toward the water. "Maybe," she replied. Koda returned to her side and leaned against her leg, the red ribbon brushing her coat. The night deepened. The fire burned lower. One by one, lanterns were carried home. When the last of the neighbors drifted away, she remained by the dock for a few moments longer. The ice beneath the lantern glow appeared solid, strong, but she knew now how it shifted beneath the surface. She looked across the lake toward the dark outline of trees. Frank had built something here, and now she was part of it. Not because of a will, but because she had chosen to stay. Koda sat beside her, his breath forming small clouds in the air. The lake lay quiet, not frozen, not breaking, waiting for spring. The ice didn't vanish overnight. It thinned first. A faint darkening beneath the surface, small circles of open water near the reeds. The sound changed too. No more sharp cracks. Now it was softer. A low shifting, like something stretching after a long sleep. By late March, the shoreline breathed again. Evelyn stood on the dock one morning just after sunrise. The boards had been reinforced the previous week. Gus and two of the boys from the apprenticeship program had worked beside her without fuss, tightening bolts and replacing warped planks. Now the dock felt steady under her boots. Koda stood at the far edge, nose lifted toward the water. He watched the movement beneath the surface the way he once watched the fireplace wall. Focused. Patient. A pair of loons called from across the lake. The sound traveled clean and hollow through the cool air. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment and let it settle. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open and shut in the breeze. The shed roof caught the morning light. The shoreline that Brent had called underutilized glowed quiet and whole. She had been here 3 months. 3 months since her name had not been spoken in a downtown office. 3 months since she had stood beside a radiator that clicked and rattled while the life she thought she knew rearranged itself. She bent and ran her fingers across the surface of the dock. Solid. Not new, not perfect, but maintained. Koda walked back toward her and pressed his shoulder against her hip. His coat had begun shedding in soft clumps that caught against the porch steps and along the grass. Spring was working on him too. "You were right," she murmured, resting her hand on his head. He tilted his face upward briefly, amber eyes steady. The first cooperative meeting of the spring was scheduled for that afternoon. The agenda included shoreline cleanup dates, marina scheduling, and confirmation of youth program funding for the summer. Her handwriting appeared beside the line item. Chair. The title had surprised her when it was suggested. She hadn't sought it. But no one else had either. Gus had simply looked at her and said, "You're already doing the work." The town had not welcomed her with applause. It had done something quieter. It had handed her responsibility. She walked back toward the cabin slowly. The door swung open easily now. The hinges had been oiled, the rug straightened, the cast iron stove cleaned and polished. The leather notebook sat on the kitchen table where she had left it the night before. She picked it up and flipped to the back again. If anything happens to me, she deserves the truth. At first, she had read the line as explanation. Now she read it differently. Not apology, not confession, trust. Frank had built the cooperative with intention. He had secured the shoreline not to control it, but to keep it from being divided. He had revised the will during a hospital stay she barely remembered clearly. Tubes, machines, conversations whispered in hallways. Maybe he had been afraid. Maybe he had been pressured. But he had not dismantled this. He had protected it separately. The cabin had never been the consolation prize. It had been the anchor. A knock sounded softly at the door. She turned. Marlene stood on the porch holding a small basket. "Morning," she called. "Morning." Marlene stepped inside and set the basket on the counter. "Blueberry scones. Thought you might need fuel before the meeting." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Thank you." Marlene's eyes drifted to the notebook in her hand. "You know," she said gently, "he never bragged about what he was doing." "I'm beginning to understand that," Evelyn replied. Marlene hesitated. "He wasn't always easy," she added. "But he cared about this lake." Evelyn nodded. "I know." After Marlene left, Evelyn stepped back outside. The ice near the dock broke apart in quiet sections, thin sheets drifting slowly away from shore. Koda barked once, not alarmed, just acknowledging the movement. The sound echoed lightly across the water. She walked to the edge and watched the open patches widen, waiting for spring. That was what the lake had been doing all along. Not frozen, not dead. Waiting. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A message from Brent. "We need to talk." She read it once. then locked the screen and slipped the phone back into her pocket. There would be conversations. There would be attempts. But not today. Today the lake was shifting, and she intended to see it. She sat at the end of the dock, boots dangling just above the waterline. Koda lowered himself beside her, front paws resting over the edge, chin near her knee. They watched in silence as a final slab of ice tilted, cracked gently, and slipped beneath the surface. The water stilled, clear, open. The hurt of the will reading had not disappeared. It had changed. The humiliation in that office had not been erased. It had been redirected. She had driven north, thinking she had been left with something small, a cabin of minimal market value. Instead, she had been handed responsibility, authority, a place that needed her steadiness. The lake had kept what Frank could not say aloud. It had kept the part of him that believed she would understand quiet things. She reached down and scratched behind Koda's ears. "You and me," she said softly. He leaned into her touch. Across the water the loons called again. The sound carried clean and certain. Sometimes what feels like being written out is simply being moved somewhere else. Not away, just forward. Evelyn stood from the dock and turned toward the cabin, the cooperative meeting, the shoreline that would need tending. Spring had arrived.
And she was exactly where she was meant to stand, not on the dock, not even by the lake, but inside the choirs she had almost mistaken for rejection. The water moved differently now, no more racking, just soft, steady ripple resting the wood beneath her bush, Koda rest against her leg, the way he had in the law office, before she understood anything, before the cabin, before the trust, before the truth. He had known something was there, not the money, not the legal language, the wall, the hollow space, the thing no one else would have looked for. She reached down and let her fingers rest in the thick fur behind his ears. All those years, she thought she had been overlooked, diminished, frightened out. But Frank hadn't erased her. He had trusted her to hold what mattered when he couldn't explain it out loud. And standing there now, with the blade open and the shoreline resting again, she realized something else too. The worst spark hadn't been losing the house. It had been believing she had lost her place. Koda leaned his way into her again, solid, certain. Sometimes the thing that sells you doesn't bark, it doesn't egg you. It just refuses to leave the wall alone until you see what's been hidden there. The wind moved gently across on the lake, and she stayed. If you had been frightened out of something you thought was your whole life, would you have had the courage to ride north and knock on the wall until it opened?